welcome to today's webinar about how to raise your first round from institutional investors. I'm super excited to be here together with Aleksandra Laska from Redalpine, partner of Redalpine, and as you will later know, she is also an entrepreneur herself, or was an entrepreneur herself, and a business angel. Now, I'd like to shortly introduce myself so that you also know who is speaking today. So I'm on the one hand a board member of WeShape Tech, but what I do in my normal life is that I'm a co-founder and CMO myself at the AI and fintech startup Yokoi. We are automating the whole process of like expense and credit card management of mid-size and bigger companies. And this is also how I got actually introduced into this very exciting topic about funding. And so today's topic actually started when I and my co-founders raised our seed round last year. We were still named Expensero back then. Today we call ourselves Yokoi. But this was actually the first touch point for myself to like be in touch with VCs, be in touch with angel investors, be in touch in valuation of your company itself. And after we successfully raised our money, actually exactly 1 year ago, many people reached out to me and asked me like, how did you raise your first round? What do I have to do? What things do I have to follow? Which information can I share? Which do's and don'ts are there? And this actually made me think about hosting a webinar, because we are very much about sharing knowledge. And this is why I reached out to Alex and asked her whether she would be my guest for this webinar. But before we go to Alex, I'd like to shortly introduce you WeShape Tech. WeShape Tech is a platform for greater diversity and inclusion in tech. We have been founded in 2016, and we have different people working for this organization for free all across Switzerland. What are we doing? So we have kind of this four pillars. On the one hand, we have the network. We want to support female talents or diverse talent through our network and really empower them. We want to introduce them to our network, because there is always someone who already went through a certain topic or a certain stage of the career. So we really connect the people with each other. The second pillar is actually the role model pillar. So we want to make females in tech visible and providing a stage and sharing their story as a role model for others. The third pillar is kind of the insights, and this is also what you're going to hear today. A lot of insights, because we are all about sharing and transferring knowledge to learn from each other and becoming better. And the fourth pillar is the jobs pillar. We regularly create social awareness campaigns and fuel the dialogue on diversity with also companies that want to make a difference in this environment. Yeah, and before we go to Alex, this is our social media handle. So if you like what you see, if you have questions, if you want to follow us, then do that. We are on all platforms. You normally find us by the WeShape Tech, simple as that. And we also have a monthly newsletter where we share our next events, but we also share a role model once a month. So sign up for our newsletter. We will only send it once a month, and the feedback we got so far is that people appreciate to know what is going on. Yeah, and now it's my great pleasure to actually introduce Alex. She's a partner at Redalpine, a leading European early stage venture capital fund with over 500 million in their fund, and they focus on tech and life science. I'm sure Alex will talk a little bit more about that just after my intro. She started her career on the Goldman Sachs trading floor in London. She went on to co-found a mobile payments platform, followed by a stint in VC and also as an angel investor. Since then, she has built the enterprise division for Improbable, supporting the business in its 600 million fundraise and hypergrowth from 20 to 400 employees. Me personally, I'm super excited to also dive a little bit deeper into that hypergrowth. Before joining Redalpine, she set up the US operations for a Swiss multi-billion-dollar robotics software company, and she graduated from King's College with a law degree. So I'm happy to now hand over to Alex, and while I'm doing that, I also ask you to actually fill out the pool that we have prepared for you. So you should now be able to share your screen, Alex.
Can you guys hear me? And do you see
Yes.
my screen?
Yep,
good.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me here today. Really appreciate that. And thank you for the wonderful introduction. So as Melanie mentioned, my name is Alex, and I'm an investor at Redalpine Venture Partners. We do early stage investments ranging from seed to Series A. And we do both tech and life science, which is quite unusual within the VC space. Typically, VC funds do either or. But we do have the know-how and expertise in-house to do valid and really solid due diligence on both sides of the spectrum. And we've been around for 15 years. So we're probably one of the older VC funds, especially for the DACH region. We invest across Europe, although our focus mostly is in the DACH region. So most of our portfolio are DACH-based. So today I'm going to talk to you about how to raise the first institutional round. I do that on a daily basis. So some things might be obvious to me that may not be obvious to you guys. So at any point, I really would like this to be a more interactive session. Please feel free to ask any questions. There is no such thing as a silly question. So first institutional rounds can be quite overwhelming and intimidating to some people. I have actually been on both sides of the spectrum. I had to ask for money, but I also had to write the checks. So hopefully I can give a fairly non-biased introduction to it. So I'm going to start with some very sort of basic stuff around where you can actually fundraise from. And in fact, there was no better time to fundraise than now because there is so much money in the market. And if anything, it's the VC funds that have a very difficult time now to encourage startups to take their money. So you have a lot of options to choose from. And here are just a few examples. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, and this is just suggestive. There are, of course, also VC funds that would invest in pre-seed stage. And there are also some super angels that would invest at later stages. So this is just a very rough outline to give you an idea where you can look for money if you desire to do so. I think there is something to be said about all of these sources. And I think I will focus on venture funds for this conversation because we are talking about the first institutional round. And since I am in a venture fund, I feel like I'm probably in the best position to talk about that channel for fundraising. So maybe we should start off with how you can raise funds. So there are different ways, and these are two examples of what typically a VC fund would use as a vehicle to invest in a startup. So one is a typical share purchase agreement, which is an equity round, essentially. Very simple. You have a valuation, a pre-agreed share price, and the investor will take a part of the company, a shareholding of the company in return for their investment. And then there is also something called a convertible note agreement, which typically includes an interest rate. It typically includes some sort of discount to the future value of the company, or some sort of cap as well. And this means that at the point of accepting the convertible note, you don't necessarily have to set yourself up for a particular valuation. This is something that sort of can happen in the future. So convertible loans very often happen at an early stage when a company maybe doesn't have enough traction to really solidify a particular valuation, or it's very difficult to put a price on the business. Both can be done by VC funds. It's probably more frequent that a typical share purchase agreement is executed than a convertible loan agreement, but they are fairly common as well. So maybe to start off with how to even go about the first steps, how to go about finding the right investor and how to approach them. So firstly, I think that you have to, when you look at investors, you have to be very clear about what it is that you are looking for and what it is that the VC investor is looking for. So the best way to go about it is just checking out their website, understanding whether your business model, sector, or geography fit in within their strategy. Sometimes you may not hear back from a VC or may hear a rejection, which is purely based on you not fitting in with their strategy and not at all the quality of your startup. So it's important also to not waste time yourself to understand who you're talking to and whether these investors would even consider you as fitting into their strategy. So some VC funds will focus purely on early stage. Other VC funds would focus purely on later stage. Some are fintech specific, others only do B2B business models. So make sure you read up on whoever you want to approach to really understand whether they fit in with your business. Secondly, understand what you are actually looking for from an investor. Are you looking for a lead? Are you looking for someone who has experience in that particular space already? In which case I would look at their existing portfolio and better understand, do they have the know-how, subject matter expertise? Is it, input for internationalization efforts? Is it input around a specific topic, regulatory, for example, that is of interest to you, that you really value? Because you should, as we just discussed, there are lots of different sources to raise funds. So apart from the money, you should really want to get something else out of your investor. And this can be expertise or network, insights, operational expertise. So I would look at the different funds and decide for yourselves who would be the best match for you. And then within the fund itself, you should look at the different individuals, and very often on the websites of the funds or on the LinkedIn profiles, you can see which companies the individuals are in charge of. So if you see a particular individual who's focused on fintech, but you're a life science company, that's probably not the right person to speak to. So make sure you sort of go to the person who has the biggest interest in your space and area. And last but not least, don't be afraid to reach out to, analyst associates. Partners are typically incredibly busy, and usually the deal flow and the initial due diligence is done by associates, investment managers. So it's very important because they will be selling your business internally to the partners before the investment decision is made. It's very important to establish a rapport with those people. So, your chances of getting a response of sorts is probably higher if you reach out to those kind of people within the organization. And yes, I would say that the one other thing to watch out for is a competing portfolio. So if you see that a VC fund has invested in the exact same business model or a very similar business, chances are, and different VC funds will have different strategies on that, but sometimes They have a strict non-compete policy, which means they will not invest in two of the same businesses that would compete against one another. So you should also watch out and make sure that whatever is in their portfolio is not a direct competitor to yourselves. I think that you probably wouldn't necessarily want to share your deck with such an investor either, as even though obviously in a professional way they wouldn't be allowed to share this further. But just to be sure, I think if I was you, from the perspective wearing my entrepreneurial hat on now, I would say be careful with those kind of funds. And again, it depends. Some funds will invest in two of the same business models. So it's not a rule per se, but there is a likelihood that they wouldn't. So once you've decided who you want to reach out to, I think that the important part is to really prepare for that outreach by doing some homework beforehand. And firstly, I think I would focus on having a very compelling pitch deck. Typically, a VC investor will ask you for a pitch deck before the first call. They would like to understand what you're doing. And before the first call, they would like to prepare themselves with a few follow-on questions and some challenges to your ideas and assumptions. And I always say that a pitch deck is almost like a business card. So it's important to get this right. And personally, I always like pitch decks that are crisp, but informative, and that are digestible, but insightful, and have a lot of information that is important to a VC fund. Now, the reason for that is you have to imagine every VC fund will have to look through hundreds and hundreds of decks, and you do increase your chances of captivating someone's attention if your deck is really straightforward, very clean cut, very organized, and has all the information that's needed. It also means that you don't waste time on a phone call explaining the most basic information because it's already there at hand. So on the left-hand side, again, this is not an exhaustive list. And what goes into a deck will also partially depend on what kind of business you're in. But typically what I would start with is, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty straight away, I would start with a very high-level vision statement, just so as soon as I open the deck, I know exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve and what problem you're solving and what the solution to that problem is. Obviously, in this process, I would highlight your unique selling point. That means what differentiates you from competition or from current solutions to the problem. It happens very, very rarely that there is not someone else already in that space trying to solve that issue. So being aware of those players and being aware of how you can differentiate and position yourself is key. Because almost certainly the VC investor will probably ask you that question. Obviously, the market size. That's very important because there has to be an understanding how you make assumptions about the potential for your solution. Is there enough appetite for people to solve this problem? Is it a big enough problem? But secondly, is there even a big enough market to make you into the next unicorn or even decacorn? The business model is very important. So it's something that I would certainly touch on as well. Any traction metrics or growth. And obviously, I would be fully aware of the competitive landscape. Making big statements like we're the only ones doing this or nobody else has done it, and then finding out that the VC investor comes back to you with 3 other companies that do something similar can be a little bit uncomfortable because it makes the investor think that you haven't done your research. So it's incredibly important that you know your competition. What is super important at early stage, so the first institutional round typically is quite early stage, it's very important to highlight the team. Why? If you don't yet have a lot of metrics, or if you don't yet have a finished product or a lot of traction, one of the most important things to look at is the team, i.e., can the team, or does the team have what it takes to basically create reality out of the vision that they're selling? And here I would highlight the key executives or the key decision makers within the business, what their role is within the business, and what their backgrounds are. So which companies they worked at and what roles. It's important typically for an investor to understand that some of the key roles have been filled with professionals that have a very relevant background in that space. There are obviously exceptions where, for instance, there are students coming straight out of uni, starting a company, who maybe don't have any professional experience. And these kind of teams, of course, also come to fundraising, but typically, if you have any kind of relevant experience, I would absolutely pay attention to writing this out. And the other thing that I haven't actually written on here is tech. So I think you should be able to very high level explain your tech and be able to sell it in a non-technical way, so in layman terms. Not every VC investor will have deep technical knowledge and background. So it's important also that you can showcase that you're able to sell a very complex idea in very simple terms. What I would, however, do is have some sort of backup slides in the appendix, for example, with more in-depth information in case you have someone in the room who is very techie and would like to find out more and dig a bit deeper. Now, what you also should do, and this is going back to know who you're talking to, is understand who's going to be in the meeting and how techie are they, or what will they pay more attention to, because it will give you an idea around what sort of questions they will ask. I typically, in the past, before having a pitch with an investor or with a potential client even, I would try to find a YouTube video of them speaking, or some sort of articles that they wrote or interviews they've done, so I better understand what's important to them and what their communication style is. So always know your audience. Then the data room. So sometimes when you do a very first institutional round, you would not have a data room. And here I would suggest that you have one ready from the early days. Why? If you haven't done it from the beginning, it will take you a really long time to set it up and to dig out all the relevant information afterwards. And a data room is something that you will continuously update and you will continuously add things to, and you will continuously need in every next round that you do with institutional investors. Now, on the left-hand side here, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just a few ideas of what you should include in any sort of data room. And it's things like a cap table, the founders' CVs. Very often the founders will also, or the key executives will be asked for ID copies. And this is typically to do anti-money laundering checks. It's typically requested from most VC funds. Any sort of legal documents, and it can range from employment contracts through to rent, through to any sort of credit lines that you have. I mean, literally anything, tax, audits, anything you might have should be in there. Typically, a VC fund, as part of their due diligence process, will do a legal due diligence process, and that's typically a lawyer who would go through all these documents. Now, unless there's a really, really red line, like some court cases or uncertainty around IP, for example, because it's currently being debated in a court setting, legal documents, typically for an early stage startup, always have some sort of feedback from the lawyers that they can be improved or made better. Look at it as an opportunity for you to professionalize as a business and take that feedback on board to better prepare your company for even the later rounds. The bigger the rounds and the more advanced the fundraising, the stricter the investor will be around these things, and they will be less, less accepting of imperfections within these documents. So every time you go through this process, it might be tedious and might be very annoying, but if I was you, I would see it as a professionalization process and use it to your advantage to better prepare your company for the next steps and for growth and for scaling. Obviously, detailed financial plan. In fact, I would argue that most VC funds would ask for a financial plan and a cap table before you even open up the data room. So they would probably ask it very early on in the process, together with the deck. And financial statements, of course, and any sort of disputes. So if there is a legal dispute around maybe your name, your trademarks, anything at all, you should include that in there. I always say it's better to be open from the get-go. Sooner or later, if the due diligence is done in a good way, any such little things might pop up, and the trust between the investor and the startup might be disturbed. So I would always be just upfront if there are any questions or questionable situations, and explain. This is the opportunity for you to explain the context of it. If something hasn't been openly said, it is very difficult to then recreate that trust. And you have to imagine the investors that invest in you, you will work with them quite closely for a very long time potentially. So it's very important to start the whole relationship on a good footing. And other matters. So when is the most optimal time to fundraise? And I always say that it differs from company to company, and it's entirely individual. Firstly, you have to look at fundraising as not only a way to get money, but also to open doors, to get access to a wider network, to get professional experience and operational experience, and to help you with later rounds further down the line, or with strategic advice around potential exits, for example. So I would fundraise not only when you need money, but when you feel that you have reached a state in your company where you could benefit from all the other things that a VC or professional investor might add and put to the table. I would say that the most optimal time to fundraise is before you need the money. You want to be in a position of strong negotiation power, and not be in the position of having to fundraise and needing the money, because you will have less opportunity to negotiate terms or negotiate the valuation. So I would always say leave yourself enough time to fundraise, because it can sometimes be a tedious and long process. Some VC funds also take quite long to do their due diligence. So you want to make sure that you have enough runway to have the money in the bank before you actually need it. What should the valuation be? This is a very difficult question to answer. I don't think there's a scientific rule. What I always say to entrepreneurs is I would approach it backwards almost. I would try to assess how much do you actually need to get to the next big milestone to justify a higher valuation at the next round. In other words, what is it that you need to achieve to justify a higher valuation? And what do you need to do? How much do you need to spend to get there? Is it marketing spend because you want to grow the business faster and you want to get to a certain revenue level? Is it hiring more people? Is it, increased customer service or internationalization or anything of that sort? So very often VC funds will actually question also, why do you need that much? And what will you do with that money? Where will you be with that amount of money? The one thing I would say is that although there is a lot of money in the market, I would be careful to raise too much money. And the reason for that is if you raise too much money, there will be a huge anticipation and expectation in the market that with so much money, you should be achieving a very high level of, milestones and improvements and growth. And sometimes that's just not the case. So I'm always a fan of having enough to get to the next level, but not too much, so you can still raise a good round further down the line at a solid valuation. So obviously, as a founder, you also don't want to be diluted too much. So depending on how big your ticket is, that will obviously also influence the valuation of the business. And if your valuation is very high, it might be very difficult for you to raise further down the line unless you have really achieved something incredible. So this is something I would really just think about internally, what you feel comfortable with. I always find it very encouraging when startups come to me with questions. So typically at the end of a pitch, I will always leave time for them to ask me questions. I think any sophisticated entrepreneur will want to find out something about the investor, because again, you will be working very closely with each other. So I would find it incredibly important what the investor can bring to the table beyond just the money. And I actually quite like it when it's me being challenged in a pitch session every now and then as well. And I have to sort of sell myself to the startup. And I think you should use this to your advantage. At the end of the day, every pitch and every interaction you have with a VC fund is also for you to get to know the investor and the VC fund and understand whether this is the right match for you. So always come with some questions. You can be very blunt and ask, beyond money, what else can you bring to the table? How much experience do you have in this particular subject matter or in this particular business model? Or maybe or expansion is important to you. Maybe you want someone who has been in that space operationally. So I think there's many different ways for you to find out whether this is the right investor for you and can provide you with more than just the monetary value. And maybe an obvious one, but it has happened to me before: do not communicate with investors via an assistant. And this is especially important at the early stages. If you do a first round with an institutional investor, the assumption would be that you're bootstrapped, which means you shouldn't have the money for an assistant in the first place. And secondly, it's very off-putting if you feel that the entrepreneur, the founder, is too important to speak to you directly, especially at such an early stage. I don't use an assistant. I speak to people directly. I would expect the same from you. If I have the time to do it, you have the time to do it too. And it's also a sign of respect, I think, for the investor that, you basically consider this an important enough interaction to not hospital pass it to another person. So this is another thing that I would really, really highlight. The other thing that sometimes happens is, when an investor gives you feedback or asks for more information, and the entrepreneur on the other side asks whether you can send them an email with everything you just said. I'm more than happy to repeat what I said, but I really have a lot of work to do every day. So I'm probably not willing to send you a follow-up email because I would expect you to listen to it and just make notes whilst I speak. So that's another one that, again, might be very obvious to some people, but I'm just mentioning it because it has happened to me before. And I think I would just avoid such situations because they might be, received in the wrong way, I guess. So these are just very high level points that I thought of when I thought about this talk, but of course I realized that I do it day to day. So there might be some questions that you have that I haven't thought of. So I suggest now, Melanie, if you don't mind, if we give the floor to the audience and just offer people an opportunity to ask questions.
Absolutely. Just for everyone who has a question, shoot. Thank you very much, Alex. It was very insightful already now.
Hi, I have a question. Ria speaking from New York City. Is it actually helpful to follow up on an investment like inquiry if you don't hear back from them? Or is that already a sign of don't even try anymore because it's either not the focus or they're too busy or we just don't fit?
I would absolutely always follow up, at least with one email. I think that's totally fine. Sometimes you catch someone during an incredibly busy time and they haven't had time to respond, and then it just escapes them. So, and it happened to me on the other end of the spectrum a few times, where I would send one email without a response, and then the second one they would respond to immediately, and actually typically be sort of apologetic that they didn't reply to the first one. So I wouldn't be scared to follow up at all. I think if you have sent 3 or 4 emails and you haven't heard back, then maybe it's time to move on to other investors, because I think it also, so on my end, I really try to reply to everyone that reaches out to me. Sometimes it takes a while because of the sheer volume. I think if someone sends you 4 emails and you didn't bother to even reply, sorry, this is not for me, it's probably also very telling of the kind of investor that they are. So you should then have a think about whether you even want to work with someone like that. But again, there are VC funds where I wouldn't take it personally, because they simply have too much in their inbox and they don't have the capacity to reply to every single email. I try to do it, but it doesn't mean that emails don't escape me every now and then as well.
Cool, thanks. That sounds great. Thank you.
If I may, I have 2 questions actually for you. On one hand, I would like to understand your view on advisory boards, because I'm thinking of potentially like building a business around that, because I believe that they're quite important, especially for founders that come straight from uni. Because that's where you get your expertise and your seniority in. But I would love to hear your professional view on it. And then the other question, I'll just pose it already as well. We know that there's about 2% of venture capital money that goes into women-led companies, right? I think it is getting better. I think they're hitting the radar a bit more now. What's your view on that? And what are your tips and tricks to kind of like basically help female founders?
Yeah, second topic, very passionate about that. And actually the Atomica report recently mentioned it's 8%, but it's pretty bad, quite frankly, but I'll touch on that in a second. So advisory boards, very good question, and something to really be strategic about. I think advisory boards can be a sign of credibility, especially if you're an early stage business with maybe no previous track record of founding a business. Very important. Having said that, I would be very careful, because it could also speak against you. So I would be very careful who you have in your advisory board. And I give you an example. I have spoken to a startup who has asked me whether I could help them with a fundraise. They didn't fit into our scope, so they asked me to do this in my free time. I said no, because I didn't have time, but I've noticed that in their advisory board, they had 4 big shot people, great names, very famous, but had absolutely nothing to do with the business, had no background in tech, had no background in the sector, didn't invest in the business, so didn't have a vested interest, which means that they had no skin in the game, yet they received a percentage of the business. And what I came back to them with is, so guys, you have given equity to all these amazing people. Why are they not making why do you have to reach out to me to open doors? Why don't you use those guys and make them work for their equity, So I would be very careful. I would only use advisors who can actually give you help open doors within the space that is relevant to you. Even if someone is a fantastic name, if they're not relevant to your business, I don't think VC funds would care that much that you have that person on board. And I would incentivize them by, maybe making them an angel investor as well, potentially. It depends on your negotiation power, of course, in the setup. You may want to entice them with free equity to begin with, but I would really be strategic about it. But important, absolutely important. It can definitely add to credibility. Around female founders, so I thought very long and hard about what is causing this discrepancy. And what I haven't been able to figure out is whether it's just a case of that there's simply fewer female founders who are in a space that's actually VC fundable. So VC funds typically invest in very tech heavy businesses. So are there just simply a smaller pool of female founders to choose from? I haven't been able to answer that question, to be honest, so I don't know. But I think it's a combination of network, which is partially why I organized office hours for women, because one of the theories is that a lot of the people in venture capital are people who used to do finance before, and finance, the traditional finance anyway, is very male dominated. So typically you also get in touch with VC funds via a warm introduction. That's the best way to really get a good response or get a response at all. Cold messaging might sometimes work, but it's very hard purely because, not because they don't like you, it's just they get so many of those. So naturally, if you don't have that network within that space, it's much harder for you to even get through the door to meet those people. So that's one thing. I also read some academic research. I actually am not sure whether Melanie pointed me towards this, maybe even, around how women pitch versus how men pitch, and the sort of questions we see investors ask men versus women, which is completely subconscious. It's not malicious, but it's just, ingrained, I guess, in our culture or society. I also think some of it has to do with women's nature. We're different to men, which I think should be celebrated. I think it's a great thing that we're different, otherwise life would be boring. But very often we are much more self-critical. We're not as confident. In fact, I sometimes get questions from women, how do I sell myself without sounding arrogant? I don't think a man would ask that themselves that question very often. So I think that it has to do with that as well. In terms of tips, all I can say is don't be afraid to be confident about your idea. I think there's a way to sell yourself without sounding arrogant or coming across, the wrong way. But I think confidence is very important here. And I think that the more you talk to investors, even if, what I would say is, even if you pitch and it doesn't end in an investment, see it as a learning curve. It's a great way to practice, and to become more comfortable speaking to that audience. Personally, I also hope that there will be more decision makers who are female within the VC space going forward and in the future. And I hope that having a woman at the table when you pitch helps to give you a bit more confidence as well. But in terms of what I would do as a woman, I think I would just be very confident. I wouldn't be scared to sell myself or the idea. And yeah, just knock on every door and not let yourself be put down by negative responses or, influence your decision to fundraise. I think that's the important part, to just maintain resilience. But yeah, I wish I had like a magic answer to that question. Unfortunately, I don't.
No problem. Thank you so much, because I'm exactly down the same path. I'm also fighting for the same purpose, basically. So, yeah.
I would never give up. I just wouldn't let negative answers put you down. I think that's part of the journey, unfortunately. And there will be a lot of people along the way who will be critical. And I will just keep going and have the confidence in my own idea and abilities.
Yeah, for me, it's not really, I'm not really in a fund. I'm not in a startup environment. I'm more like thinking of like doing mentoring to exactly help that and avoid that. So
I see.
That's kind of like more my path as well. So similar to yours.
Yeah.
Fighting the actual problem.
Yeah, no, I
think
it would be super helpful. Exactly, having more women like yourself ingrained in the ecosystem definitely would help, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can just talk also from our seed funding. A small story is that you really, for the not giving up. I mean, when we first pitched our ideas, no one was actually interested, and they were really like, oh, this was already solved, and no one, like, you're too late. And so we had to be creative, and what we did is that we actually we knew so many people who didn't think that this problem was solved, and we had like a prototype, and companies were wanted to even pay for the prototype because they were so frustrated with the solution that is out there. And so we had first, we took it the other way around. So we started with customers. After investors weren't interested, we could then show like the market traction. And then we went back to sometimes the same investors and we're like, hey, are you still thinking that there is no need? And afterwards there was a completely different talk, because we could actually prove that there was a lot of market potential. So often you really need to also think like, what are other ways how I can find ways to prove that there is a market need.
Basically, that's a really interesting point, because sometimes you can get your customers to become your investors, right? Or you can get them to basically pre-invest like the next 1 or 2 years of your services and like prepay you for that, and you'll just give them a reduction on that, and like that you also get money in, right?
I would be careful with strategic investors. That's probably something I haven't mentioned, because you have to think long-term about your exit opportunities. And there is nothing that speaks specifically against having a strategic investor, but you have to make sure that the legals and the decision-making is set up in such a way in the shareholder agreement that on key matters that have to do with strategic moves like M&A activity, for example, or IPOing, they will not have a say or insight into that information, because it could close your doors off. And depending on the business and depending on the strategic investor, you might put off other customers from using your business because they might feel that you're not impartial. So I don't say no to that at all, but I would be very careful and strategic about it.